Welcome to the latest installment of Transatlantic AI Conversations, where we talk to experts about AI from both sides of the Atlantic and also private sector, public sector, and the nonprofit sector. And we're so honored to have Jen Easterly in the studio with us today.
Yay.
Jen, why don't you, instead of my butchering your bio, why don't you tell us what it is you do and the importance of the agency, and then just to get us right into AI, how has AI changed the mission?
Yeah. So first of all, great to be here with you and great to be back here again. So CISA, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, it's the newest agency in the federal government. And we were stood up at the end of 2018, so just a little over 5 years old, to play two key roles. We serve as America's civilian cyber defense agency and as the national coordinator for critical infrastructure resilience and security. So the mission is to lead the national effort to understand, manage, and reduce risk to the cyber and physical infrastructure that Americans rely on every hour of every day for water, for power, for healthcare, for education, for transportation, for communication. It really is the systems and the networks and the data that drive our daily lives. And because CISA is not a regulator, a law enforcement agency, or an intel agency, we are purely a partnership agency. So
I see.
Everything we do is by, with, and through partners, whether that's industry, including generative AI companies, whether that's state and local officials, including election officials, because we're responsible for election infrastructure security, whether that's academia or nonprofits or researchers. Really what we use, our superpower, is being able to catalyze trusted partnerships given our expertise and experience in the protection of critical infrastructure.
So you just put out these safety and security guidelines, are they? Are they voluntary? Are they mandatory? How does that fit into the framework you just described?
You know, they're voluntary guidelines, but if I take a step back, you asked about AI. So, you know, we're in D.C. You can't speak to a government official, and there's no role that they're not doing in AI. Everybody's doing some sort of
Private sector as well, yeah.
Yes, exactly. So we operate very much at the nexus of cyber defense and critical infrastructure. That really is our focus, and that was articulated in the president's executive order. And it gave us 3 buckets of tasks. The first one is about how we can protect critical infrastructure from threats of AI. And so pursuant to that, we issued these secure guidelines for critical infrastructure owners and operators to maximize the potential of AI, but to be able to manage and mitigate risks from AI within critical infrastructure. So that's one bucket, and that's why we put out those guidelines, and I'll come back to the voluntary piece. But the second bucket is really under the umbrella of how we can optimize AI for our mission. And we have, unsurprisingly, been using AI for many years. Cybersecurity has been using machine learning algorithms to help us detect threats so that we can mitigate risk to infrastructure. And now these new capabilities, generative AI and large language models, help us turbocharge the ability to detect and mitigate cyber threats. So one of the things we were asked to do in the executive order is essentially a pilot for cyber defense to see how we can use some of these new capabilities to detect threats to the federal civilian executive branch, essentially the civilian.gov, because we're responsible for protecting that. So we just did that pilot, and we're writing up the findings of that. So that's the second big bucket. The third is assurance of AI systems. So this is making sure that generative AI systems are as secure as possible so that nefarious actors, whether it's terrorists or cyber criminals or rogue nations, can't take advantage of those capabilities and use them for malicious purposes. And so we have experts who do things like red teaming, which is basically how you can break into systems. And we're actually working very closely with our teammates at NIST, the National Institute for Standard and Technology. And the guidelines that we put out actually are grounded in the AI risk management framework, but they're specifically seen through a lens of critical infrastructure owners and operators. And so it's a great partnership we have with the NIST team. And with the guidelines, but also with the red teaming work. And so we're going to continue to work with them, specifically doing the red teaming from a cybersecurity perspective.
So can we unpack a little bit of that? Because a lot of the people who we've had talk to us from the private sector have the vaguest notion of what regulation means. They just think it's bad. And you just went through a whole bunch of stuff that they may not be familiar with. And let's just unpack it and talk about why you all are doing it. It's obviously not to kill innovation and kill jobs. At least I hope not. So start with the first one. When you say AI can be used both as a defense and offensively in cyber threats to our critical infrastructure, just can you give us some examples and how these guidelines might help?
So to be very clear, we're not a regulatory agency. Yep. We are a voluntary partnership agency.
Thanks.
And I would also say I think it's important to just stipulate that AI capabilities will do amazing things.
Right.
Incredible promise. That said, I look at these capabilities, which are moving faster, which are more unpredictable, and which are more powerful than any technology we've seen. And I look at them through the lens of the past 4 decades of technology, where nobody was talking about that R word. Nobody was talking about regulation for technology because there was this fear that if you regulated, if you put any guardrails on technology in any way, it would stifle the engine of innovation. Now, I believe you can have responsible innovation. And in a technology as powerful as AI capabilities, I believe it's essential to have responsible innovation, meaning there are guardrails around how these capabilities can be fielded and used. And again, this is informed by the fact that technology for the past 4 decades never prioritized security and safety, never. It was always about speed to market and how many cool features we can put on that device. Security was a bolt-on. It's why we have a multi-billion-dollar cybersecurity industry.
Right.
It's why we have an internet that's full of malware. It's why we have software full of vulnerabilities. It's why we have social media that's full of disinformation. The ethos of move fast and break things cannot be applied to the world of generative AI because this technology is too powerful and maybe too dangerous. So our role is to ensure, and remember, not a regulator, but technical experts. So our role is to ensure we can maximize the promise of AI while also being able to mitigate for critical infrastructure that Americans rely upon to mitigate the risks. And I think about this very broadly through the lens of my career, which is cybersecurity, intelligence, and counterterrorism. And I had a real sort of illumination moment when I was the executive assistant to Conley. It was 2004, and she was testifying before the 9/11 Commission. I was her executive assistant, sat behind her. And I remember very clearly Tom Kane, who you recall was one of the co-chairmen of the 9/11 Commission, where he talked about, this was a threat that was growing for some considerable period of time. We weren't prepared for it. It was a failure of management, a failure of policy, a failure of capability, but above all, a failure of imagination. And I look at the past 15 months and I think about how the world, the imagination has been captured by these AI capabilities, but I fundamentally believe that it is the responsibility of leaders, whether that's government or in industry, to ensure we can leverage the power of imagination, but avoid the failure of imagination.
Right.
And so I believe it's possible to have responsible innovation. I believe it's possible to have guardrails to mitigate risk. And the good news is, Karen, so does industry. Because if you listen to any of the folks in industry, they also agree that we need to ensure that these capabilities are being developed responsibly. And so while we're not a regulator, the technical standards and guidelines that were created with over a dozen of our international partners, with feedback from over 20 AI companies, that can be used to help form the technical basis for any regulatory standards that are out there. And so what we want to do is ensure that we are providing, again, from a technical perspective, what developers of these capabilities should be doing to develop, test, design, deploy, deliver, and operate and maintain these capabilities in a way that is safe and secure.
So for those who don't know, Jen, you have a background both in the Army and running cybersecurity for a bank. So you have a 360 view, if you will, of cybersecurity. Could you give us some examples for those of us who lack an imagination, maybe, that you've forced yourself to have about the kinds of cyber risks that we're talking about and how some of these expert standards or guidelines will help?
Yeah. So just broadly characterizing AI as a technology. If you think about, again, when you're building technology, when you're building the box of software, there are very important things that can be done as you are designing and testing and building and deploying that can ensure you are dramatically reducing the number of vulnerabilities or flaws in the code which can be exploited by threat actors. So just broadly, that's what we talk about, is developing things to minimize the pathways that criminals, terrorists, rogue nations could use to co-opt that technology for purposes that could create risks to our critical infrastructure. What do I mean? Cyber attacks. So think about the type of malware that can constantly morph. You have defenses that you build that prevent attacks from coming in or can detect them very rapidly, and then systems that can mitigate those threats coming in. So think about threats that even if it meets a defense, it can then morph and kind of come in a different way. So the type of malware that is constantly morphing that can evade defenses so that you can then penetrate into critical infrastructure, and you could steal data, you could steal intellectual property, or more nefariously, frankly, what we're seeing with respect to Chinese cyberspace actors, specifically called Volt Typhoon, we're seeing them burrow in past our defenses, not for espionage, but rather to pre-position for disruptive or destructive attacks. So think about that being supercharged through the use of generative AI. So that's one class of things. The second, I would point to you from my days as the head of counterterrorism at the White House in the Obama administration. And back then, we used to be very concerned about Al-Qaeda and ISIS and their capability to develop things like chemical weapons or biological weapons, and it was always the bomb makers. So you think about the bomb makers and terrorist organizations turbocharged by the AI experts now, or the people who have knowledge of AI. So being able to build those types of weapons, I find very worrying. Okay, so two types of examples. I don't want to be all like doom and gloom, though,
no,
because
just understand.
Yeah, because I do think that there is incredible promise. I mean, I have, through my life, I have developed a deep passion and a deep love of technology because I've seen how technology can be used to save lives. I saw that when I was stationed in Iraq, and we were using technology from the National Security Agency to better illuminate terrorist networks so that we could take them off the battlefield. So there is great promise in this. It's just because of the power, the unpredictability, and the speed of this particular technology. I think another facet of it, just to be very frank, is you think about the most powerful weapons of the last century. They were built and safeguarded by governments who are disincentivized to use them. These capabilities are now largely built by the private sector, who, at the end of the day, have fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders to produce profit. And so the incentives are different at the end of the day. I very much hope that we are able to come to a place where we can put the guardrails and put the regulatory framework in place to ensure we can maximize the incredible opportunities from these technologies, while again being able to mitigate the very real risks. And I think we do need to learn from the past where technology was not focused on security. And that's why at CISA, we're really leading this, what we call the secure by design revolution. And, I don't want this to come off like government says. That's not it at all. And frankly, security people in the private sector, I know this from my time at Morgan Stanley, they don't want to provide insecure products to their clients or customers. We all believe in making sure that you are providing the best product, and security can be a differentiator. That's certainly how we treated it at Morgan Stanley. So we've been doing this work with our industry colleagues, whether that's generative AI, the guidelines that I mentioned that we actually put out with the Brits, the National Cybersecurity Center, specific guidelines for creating and developing AI. That was, again, with the generative AI companies. It was with other international partners. And we are working hand in hand. The pledge that was just signed at the RSA conference, the biggest cybersecurity conference in the world, was signed with 68 of the leading software manufacturers who all said, yeah, this is a really important thing. And they know it's a differentiator because, end users, small businesses, we shouldn't have the burden of securing our devices on our own.
Absolutely.
We shouldn't be bearing that liability. It's the manufacturers that are creating these things who should be building and baking in security on the front end. And the same thing applies to AI.
So one more question about an example. You talked about the Chinese burrowing into some of our infrastructure that will keep us all up at night. What are you doing? What can be done about that?
Yeah. So and I'll say, I think it's really important because this is actually a positive thing that we're talking to the technology companies from an AI perspective. The way that the Chinese are able to get into our critical infrastructure, and we've found them and evicted them, so people should feel a little better about that, working with the private sector, but we found them and evicted them from multiple critical infrastructure sectors, including water, communication, transportation, and power. And so the good news is we are working with companies. We're using those, what we call hunts or incident response, to provide advisories and guidance so that other critical infrastructure owners and operators can hunt on their own networks and can mitigate this risk.
So they can learn.
They can risk. But I want to come back to a resilience point. But the way that the Chinese cyber actors are getting into our critical infrastructure, very similar to the way that cyber criminals are launching ransomware attacks across the country, across the world, on businesses large and small, hospitals, Change Healthcare, Ascension Healthcare, having real effects on people's lives. The way that they're getting in is not some exotic, highly sophisticated, expensive technique. The way they're getting in is taking advantage of basic flaws and defects in the technology. And that's what we are trying hard to prevent. We need to add friction. We need to make it harder and harder for our adversaries, whether it's terrorists or cyber criminals or even well-resourced nation-state actors who you would think would be using exotic techniques, but they're not. Because what they're doing is they're using these openings in network edge devices to get in there and to jump into our critical infrastructure. So what can AI do? Well, a lot of the vulnerabilities that we are trying to reduce to ultimately make ransomware and attacks a shocking anomaly, that's my goal. The way we can reduce them is to ensure that the code is safer. So without getting too technical, although I'm sure there's some good nerds out there in your audience who will love this, there's some code is called memory safe code. And typically it's coding in a language called C and C++. And it is the type of unsafe code that introduces very common classes of vulnerabilities. And you can think about vulnerabilities as just that hole in the code where threat actors can get their way in. And so what AI can do is potentially rewrite that code so it is now safe and secure. So if you can think about like the Matrix, right? You can think about an AI capability that can see all those flaws in the code and can rewrite it so it's now safer and more secure code. So you remove entire classes of vulnerabilities. That would be an amazing thing.
Spell check.
Those are spell check for code, right? So those are the kind of things that get me really jazzed, because if we can dramatically reduce the number of vulnerabilities, Like, we have a much more cyber secure world.
So touch us a little bit about open models, open AI. There's a big debate about that, and one of the issues that comes up is security. Do you think that introduces more vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be really frank. I had a strong opinion on this when I first started seeing this, which was, I thought it was pretty irresponsible, all the open sourcing, because I was very worried, informed by my background in trying to manage and frankly reduce risk, in my background with cyber criminals, in my background with terrorists. I was very worried about the fact that some of these open source models could be used by rogue actors.
Yeah.
So I had a long conversation with people who know a lot more than me about open source software security. And now I think I'm a little more balanced in my view, because at the end of the day, the virtue of open source software is that you have an entire community of people who are looking at it and finding those flaws and defects and helping to improve it.
A little more wisdom of the crowd.
And so exactly, the wisdom of the crowd. Now, the problem is the open source community is notoriously not well resourced. And while you do have that wisdom of the crowd doesn't necessarily tend to be, they're more poorly resourced. So I am less skeptical of open sourcing these types of models, but I do think it requires that if these open source models, and it's not like anyone's going to stop it because the companies continue this, we do need to make sure that they are taking advantage of the wisdom of the crowd. I think that's a great way to put it.
So like bounties and so on.
Yeah, but just broadly that like the community is ensuring. And by the way, like we have real open source experts. Ava Black is one of our leads, and they're amazing, and Jack Cable. And we just had a whole open source software security summit where we brought in all the players from civil society and the private sector to talk about how we can work together to make a more safe and secure ecosystem. We put out a roadmap on this. If folks are interested, we have guidelines for people. It's called package maintainers. Essentially, they maintain the open source libraries. And so we're helping on the advocating for resources. So we have real expertise on this. And again, it's a great community, but it's one that requires constant attention and resources and focus.
That's fascinating. And what about internationally? So obviously the internet is global. These technologies are global. They don't stop at the border, but there are, obviously nation states that have hostile intentions. So how do you, or just don't want to cooperate? So who do you decide who to work with, and what kinds of progress has there been?
Yeah, I mean, just like you said, cyber has no borders. So it truly is an international sport. And I spent a lot of time with our foreign partners. When I was out at RSA, we met with our South Korean counterparts, our Australian, Israeli counterparts, just met with the Canadians last night, meeting with the Ukrainians tonight. Wow. So it really is a recognition that, quite frankly, whether you're an international partner or a government or state and local or industry, everybody has some visibility into the threat environment. And being able to connect the proverbial dots of the threats is incredibly important in terms of lowering the risk. It's also incredibly important because cyber defense in Europe is no different from cyber defense in the US. And so what we want, and many of these companies are multinational companies, so we want consistent guidance going to the private sector about best practices, the threats that we see, the best mitigation. So the vast majority of the advisories and the alerts and the guidance that we put out is co-sealed at the very minimum by our Five Eyes partners, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but we've expanded that. And in fact, the secure guidelines that we did for AI, the secure by design guidance that we put out in October, have been co-sealed by many more international partners. And so it truly is an effort that reflects the fact that rights-respecting nations absolutely agree that these capabilities are too powerful to not be developed with security in mind. I was at the AI Safety Summit in Bletchley, and that was a major theme of that conference was the importance of secure development. And, I'm wondering if people watching this are saying this, oh, blah, 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 secure development. Like, at the end of the day, it is stunningly different to be talking about secure development of these capabilities. Like, wind back the clock. Nobody was putting out guidance on secure development of technology 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. If you think about the creation of the internet, and you say, go back 40 years, 1983, when protocols were developed to allow computers to talk to each other. Famously, one of the pioneers, the late Dan Kaminsky, had this great quote. He said, the internet was never invented to be secure. The internet was created to move pictures of cats.
Yeah.
And it's very good at that. So it really is a completely different cultural mindset to think about secure technology in the way that we're thinking about it, right? From the beginning, bake it in. And it's a message that, a niche part of the security community has been saying for years. But when you have across the private sector, when you have across government, some of whom, by the way, Karen, do have regulatory authority.
Right.
Which is important because when you think about as they develop regulations, they can use the technical guidance that we've been co-developing to underpin those rules and regulations.
So this is industry best standard.
Right, industry best standard. And because it's had the feedback of input from the AI companies who have said they believe that there need to be guardrails, this is not we are imposing upon you. This is more about we are co-creating a framework that can reduce risk to citizens around the world.
That's great. And you were talking about rights respecting nations. What about those that are a little less rights respecting? You talked about ransomware. Is there any progress with Russia in allowing ransomware? And I know, just to stick on the Russia theme for a second, Ukraine has been a cyber success. And so maybe you can just talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of has there been progress, I couldn't speak to the diplomacy or the policy issues. We don't work with Russia from a cyber defense perspective. And even if that were an option, I don't think I would take it. I think Russia's, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, its barbarity, is unconscionable. And we work very closely with Ukraine. We have a memorandum of understanding that we signed in 2022, where we provide training and resources and information and exercise support to the Ukrainian cyber defenders. And, I was there in February with Ambassador Nate Fick, our cyber ambassador for the International Kyiv Cyber Resilience Forum. And, I've been in 3 combat tours, so I understand what it's like to be in a combat zone. But boy, how impressive that every citizen is demonstrating an incredible degree of resilience, human resilience, societal resilience, not just cyber resilience and infrastructure and operational resilience, but human resilience. And that is something that America needs to take a really hard look at. Because if we do have to deal with a situation where we see mass disruption in the event of a major conflict in the Taiwan Straits, we need to be prepared for that. We need to expect that disruption. We need to build our systems and our people and our architectures to be able to recover from disruption. And, Ukraine is a shining example of that, and we will continue to support them. As I said when I came back, and I was very glad to see the $61 billion pass, but, it was hopefully not too late.
Yeah.
Because incredibly important that we continue to support Ukraine, because it's sending a real message to President Xi if we don't support Ukraine about deterrence. And if we fail to defend Ukraine, that's a failure to deter China from taking Taiwan.
And it also introduces some friction for Putin as he tries his little exercises in Europe. You said election infrastructure is part of your purview. How does that work? Because we're in a federal system and states are very proprietary about their election infrastructure, and it's become such a political morass. Can you tell us a little bit about how secure our election infrastructure is and what you're doing to keep it secure?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to. So since 2017, election infrastructure was designated by the federal government as critical infrastructure off the back of the Russian attempts to influence our elections. So election infrastructure is now critical. And CISA was designated as what's called the Sector Risk Management Agency for the election infrastructure subsector, meaning that we work to help state and local election officials who are in the front lines of defending democracy, who administer, manage, and secure elections. We help them manage that risk by providing resources and training and information. Now, since 2017, CISA and our partners have made significant progress in improving the security and resilience of election infrastructure, working to support those state and local election officials. And as a result, those election officials ran secure elections in 2018 and 2020 and in 2022. And as you know, there's no evidence that malicious actors changed, altered, or deleted votes or had any impact on the outcome of any election. And that's been validated time and again to include in multiple court challenges. And, in any place that was close in 2020, there were paper records that were counted and recounted and audited to ensure accuracy. In this job, given our role, I've spent an enormous amount of time with chief election officials of both parties across the country. And so I know how tirelessly they work to ensure that every one of their citizens' votes are counted as cast. And it's why I have great confidence in the integrity of our elections and why the American people should as well. However, we cannot be complacent. While election infrastructure is more secure than ever, the threat environment is more complex than ever. So if you look at some of the reports that have come out from the Director of National Intelligence, you'd see that our foreign adversaries remain intent on interfering in our elections to undermine American confidence in the integrity of our elections, to sow partisan discord. And those efforts will absolutely be exacerbated by the use of generative AI capabilities. But even more worrying is the continuing physical threats to election officials, largely stemming from unfounded claims that the results of the 2020 election did not reflect the will of the American people. And I hope we can agree that such claims, unwarranted claims of fraud, are really corrosive to the sacred traditions of democracy. And by the way, Karen, they've led to harassment and threats of violence to election officials and their families.
Oh, yeah.
And as a result, we've seen this wave of resignations of election officials who've taken with them years of critical institutional knowledge and operational experience. And many of those who remain are operating in difficult conditions. And it's why we at CISA are so proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with those election officials, those election heroes who are serving on the front lines of democracy. And so, in fact, we are doing more services in more jurisdictions than ever before. All of the resources and training is on our Protect 2024 website. We've provided more than 340 cybersecurity assessments, 520 physical security assessments, 70 exercises, 220 trainings, security clearances, vulnerability reports. And one thing I'm excited about is we just hired these 10 election security advisors across the country who bring a combined 210 years of election experience to do direct support for election stakeholders. Now, when it comes to foreign malign influence, we're continuing to engage on that threat. We provide updated guidance on how adversaries use tactics of disinformation. We have a rumor versus reality website to provide accurate information. But most importantly, we are amplifying the voices of state and local election officials because, to your question, they are the ones who are the authoritative subject matter experts. And oh, by the way, those election officials know that while elections are political, election security is not. And we at CISA are committed to keeping it that way.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for that. And GMF, I'm sure you know, has done a lot of work on democracy, election protection, and disinformation.
We greatly appreciate that.
Yeah. You've been really generous with your time, but I know we've only touched the tip of the work that your agency does. And so maybe you can provide what we ask all our guests to provide, which is a couple of pieces of content for people who are interested and want to follow up.
Yeah,
And we'll
love to.
We'll link to that.
First
on
of
our
all,
website.
CISA.gov.
Okay.
Go to our website. You can see our AI roadmap. You can see our secured guidelines. You can see all the work that we've done. That's my unpaid political announcement.
Wonderful.
But if you go to our website, you can also see our Cyber Schoolhouse Rock inspired public service awareness campaign.
Nice. Okay, definitely.
Secure our world. So do that. I'd say two other things. One, if you are interested in AI threats to elections, I did a Peace and Foreign Affairs with our senior election advisor, Cait Conley, and then the Secretary of State of Kansas, Scott Schwab, talking specifically about generative AI and elections. So kind of gives you broad threats, but also how election officials can manage that. And, you know, the other one I'd say, I recently read Mustafa Suleyman's the book, The Coming Wave.
Yes.
Which I thought was really interesting. I mean, it's a pretty clear-eyed view of the threats, but also provides some pretty interesting policy prescriptions. So I'd recommend that one as well. Just as, you know, if you're interested in articles, books, those two.
Jen Easterly, thank you so much for being in the studio.
Rock on. Thank you very much.